So would you please join me in welcoming our three speakers today? Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Michael, Mandana and Paul to tell you about the development and creation of this exhibition and the extraordinary story, really, of the research.
Well, I'll start, I guess, it's sort of, this exhibition has all happened very quickly. It was only about 6 months ago that Paul decided to make contact with me, just to sort of, I guess, let me know that he's had this strong interest in this group of performers for over 25 years. And he'd recently written a paper summing up their journey. And he'd put in quite a lot of effort into putting that information together. And then over, I guess, the last sort of 25 years, I wouldn't say I'd been researching this group of performers, but I had spent, as I'm always doing, whenever I see photos of any Aboriginal people, I always make a copy of them and file them away. So over sort of a 25-year period, I'd gotten to know this story, just grabbing every photo that I just happened to come across. So when Paul approached me, I said, well, I then went off and started putting together a PowerPoint presentation and just going back to my own archives and grabbing, scanning any old photocopies or press clippings or anything I had to try and put this story together. And then I'd arranged to meet with Paul a few weeks later, and in that time I said that there'd been a change in her programming here, and said, did I just happen to have a research project that I could possibly turn into an exhibition? And I said, well, I just happened to have been working on something. I didn't say it was only for 2 weeks. But and then after about 3 weeks of very fast research, we met, Mandana and I met with Paul, and then we met with Diana, and we were given a deadline that it was 5 months away before we opened. So here we are.
Yeah, well, it's actually been 45 years, I think. No, 45 years that I've been working on it. But one of my first commissions as a consultant anthropologist was to go looking in 1980 for the lost Wakaya tribe. The Central Land Council, under the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, were mounting land claims on all of the deserts in the Northern Territory, because they were the areas that were vacant Crown land, and the Act says you can only claim vacant Crown land, and they were vacant because no whitefellas wanted them. They do now, of course, because there's minerals under them. And there was this vacant desert, and people said, well, that's the Wakaya used to live there, but we don't know where they are, and we think some of them might be in Queensland. And all there was this reference in Spencer and Gillen, who, when they travelled up the overland telegraph line in 1901, were at an intertribal ceremonial festival at the Tennant Creek Telegraph Station for about 3 or 4 weeks, and every night, every day, the large groups of performers were performing 6 or 7 ceremonies maximum a day, and there was this Wakaya senior elder who was supervising everything. And he was also running a school for Aboriginal doctors. And this bit of information in Spencer and Gillen was the only thing available that we could find, except for a paper by a guy called Brabazon Purcell that he'd read at the Royal Geographical Society in Melbourne in January 1892, and was a very sloppy piece of ethnography, sensationalising all of the things that were immoral in the eyes of Victorian people in Aboriginal lifestyles. So I sort of discarded that, but little did I realise that Brabazon Purcell was Meston's partner, and that Brabazon Purcell was filling in for Meston because they just had a big blue the day before, and Meston had resigned from the Wild Australia show. And while I was doing research on the Wakaya and looking for the descendants in Queensland, I visited the Powerhouse Museum in about 1981, and I was looking at this photo album of New South Wales Aborigines, and lo and behold, this man over here, Gutanta, Youngala, sorry, that's Youngala over there, who's a Kalkadoon, and Yungwa were looking out at me out of this album of New South Wales Aborigines. And I looked at the bottom and it had Wakaya Warrior. And suddenly realised that there was some error in the way that they had provenanced these photographs. And then that was the beginning of the research process for me. And there's a lot to tell about the research process. Maybe we should invite you to ask questions and intervene whenever you like. It's a small audience, so we're happy to just be as interactive. If you want to ask a question or put your hand up, because there's really a lot to tell. We can only brush the surface in an hour. If you look at the map around the corner, you'll see we've tried to show the timeline on the map for what happened, but Meston had this idea for this Wild Australia show to take a troop of 32 Aboriginal people from the frontier of Queensland. It was very much a Queensland initiative to take them to the international exhibition in Chicago via Europe, and also taking Queensland resources, minerals, and raising industry investment in Queensland. It was an irony in the fact that he was taking these Aboriginal people who it was believed at the time were, according to social Darwinism, the doomed race who were going to die out, and that he was going to give them the last look at the doomed race before they all disappeared from Australia. And he formed a partnership with Purcell. Purcell was the working man. Meston was just the upfront talk man. Meston was raising the finance. Purcell spent a year travelling around the back blocks of Queensland in a buggy and with a wagon, and he had to collect 3,000 artefacts and 32 Aboriginal people. There was a controversy that emerged. He was accused of taking people from the border, from a place called the Toko Waterhole, in chains, and these were the Wakaya, who he thought at the time were Queensland Aboriginal people, but they were from the central east of the Northern Territory. The troop arrived in Brisbane in 1892, in around about November, and he set up a camp right here on the somewhere either in or near the university campus, which was on the fringe of Brisbane at the time. There were a series of villages going out, like it was Twong Village and Taringa Village, and dirt roads going between them at the time. And they had their rehearsals here, and then their first performances at the exhibition ground, and another place in Brisbane which we haven't quite identified called the Opera House. And you'll see on the front of the front door of the museum some of the advertisements for the performances. And then they took off in a steamer to Sydney and performed at the Bondi Pavilion, where Charles Kerry photographed them in December 1892. And then they went on to Melbourne, and where John William Lint photographed them. So all of his photographs are over there. And then they came back, and then this is where the problem happened. The financiers didn't put all their money up. The group that they were contracting with in Melbourne disputed the contract. The scandal was breaking out about taking people in chains from the border. Financiers withdrew, and suddenly Purcell and Meston started fighting, and then Meston withdrew, and the police found the Aboriginal troops starving in Melbourne, asking for where Mr. Meston was with their rations, and then they had to. Purcell helped them contract small performances and sell off artefacts and get back to Sydney. It was pre-federation, so the Victorian government was arguing that it wasn't their responsibility with the New South Wales colonial government, and they were arguing with the Queensland government who was going to pay to get these Aboriginal people back. They didn't get back till Sydney till the middle of the year, and then eventually Tozer from the government in Brisbane stepped in and paid for their steam steamship fares back to Brisbane. So I probably left out a lot of details there, but that was basically what happened. And Charles Kent, the three leading photographers at the time, photographed them. So I'll just let Michael fill in some of the things I've left out.
Yeah, I think, well, really, yeah, for me, as I said, I mean, Paul had been researching this for so long. So when I started this researching, we had access to all Paul's research. Then once I put all the photographs together, I then realised that, and there'd been a mismatch. Some of these photos have had names written on them, and that's how they were sold over 100 years ago, with some of their names. Others had a river or a region written on them. Others had nothing. Others just had Queensland or something like that. But I managed to put all these photos together. And then there was this great photo held by the State Library. And in that photo there was I counted 26 people. And it was in this album. And that was put together in the 1890s as a gift to a government person. And I went through the album and I said, right, I'll try and name, I've got enough information, I'll try and name these 26 people. And then I realised, but there should be 27 people, so there's one person missing. But I named every single one of them. And then and I was wondering where this 26th person, 27th person was. Pardon? Oh, the album, yeah, there's a beautiful album that was actually a gift to a local German businessman that was returning back to Germany. And this was the gift from the Queensland government to him to take back to Germany to show some scenes of Queensland. But it was the Wild Australia performers that were the very first page in this album. And so I was again trying to figure out where the 27th person was, and then thanks to a friend of mine, Michael Graham Stewart, a private photo collector based in London and New Zealand, he sent me 2 photos, and then I'd get to see the full frame of the photo when that 27th person had actually moved as the exposure was taken, and it was all blurry. So the photographer in the Queensland album, photo held in the State Library, he'd been cropped off. So then finally we had even though we had all 27 people in one photo. And then the other great find was all these lint photos, all held in the British Museum in one album. And that was another, I guess, incredibly historically important album that John W. Lint put together. He bound the album, and on the 27th of March 1893 in Melbourne, Lint handed them over to Purcell. And that album, I think, somehow ended up in America, and then it's been in the British Museum for many years. And in that album, every person bar one was named. And the one person that wasn't, we managed to get her name from match her up from press clippings. So we've ended up with this massive, incredible body of press clippings describing every detail, with names mentioned. So all these different photos. But there was quite a conflict in the names. There was various spellings, and then also some people had completely different names that didn't even match up at all. So it's Paul working with the linguist Gavin Breen, and you'll see when you walk in here on the first wall, we've actually standardised the names of all these people. So some of the names are as the photographers wrote down, and others are different. But I think they're a lot easier to say now compared to once Paul and Gavin have put that work in. So to me, that's one of the greatest things about this thing. We've actually named every one of these people, and also, as I hope Margaret agrees with our approach, having a linguist here. But I think it was important. We couldn't have an exhibition where every time you looked at a person, they had a different name. So it was important to standardise them. So there could be many years of debate about those names themselves.
So, in a nutshell, Michael had all these photos, and he was able to sort them mainly using the cicatrices and scars, because the photographers were obviously so visually preoccupied, not only with the gaze, but with the scars and the scarification. But the scarification are a way to sort the photos, and so we might have 10 of one guy, and he's got all different names on it, and different tribal groups, and trying to then make sense of that and settle on an identity for each person, to bring them, to personalise them, was the sort of the benefit of us coming together. And so there's 5 Wakaya from the Central East Northern Territory. There's a guy who's seems to be a Kalkadoon, but may have been a mixed descent with a Gulf parent. In the Gulf, southeastern Gulf, we've got Gutdant and Gujar people from the coast around Karumba and Normanton, and then inland around the on the Gilbert River, we've got Wallangama and Bugulmara and Arilba people, and then one Miquelon person from the southern Gulf, and then we've got 5 Prince of Wales Islanders from Muralug in the Torres Strait, and one man from the Cubby Yamura, who was described as Meston's pet, also known as Bob. And there's there are a lot of ongoing research challenges and problems. We're just starting the research, really. One is that they're billed as a troop of 32 at the start, but by the time we get to these big albums being compiled, they're 27. They're down to 27. There was always talk about bringing other people from the rainforest area, and a lot of the artefacts from the rainforest area. Meston actually, at one stage in his life, owned a property on the Barron River, took up a pastoral property on the frontier on the Barron River. And curiously then, there's a lot of rainforest artefacts travelling with the troop, and we have the stage sets that were prepared by a famous stage set artist in Brisbane at the time of Bellenden Kerr, Mount Bellenden Kerr in rainforest. So if you look at the photographs of the native police attacks over here, you'll see that view of Bellenden Kerr. So there are these other infusions of various sorts coming in. There was talk in Purcell's lecture about other people that he encountered on the in the Channel country. So we're still trying to understand all of the places he went and where he was trying to conscript people. But
yeah, sure. One of the interesting articles that came about describing a flora shore has started another journey, a research potential that could potentially put a personal side to how the troop were thinking at the time. Ms. Shaw was the Times correspondent at the time, and she was the first female journalist internationally to pen her own name to her journalistic stories and be publicly known and attending events as the Times correspondent, female Times correspondent. So there's a wealth of information in her personal papers held in Scotland, and that's my next stop point of call. I think finding out whether or not she wrote to her sister about her trip. She was actually travelling throughout Queensland covering the sugar plantation history and the sort of changes that had happened within the 30 years prior and that decade, that early 1890s. And her public writing and her books that she published about that time don't actually reference the Wild Australia troop, but I'm hoping that her Wild Australia mementos are more of a personal connection, and that she was actually on that paddle steamer that was travelling in Brisbane, one of the first photographs as you see as you walk into the exhibition. And I think a different perspective and possibly a female perspective is needed, and that's something that we're hoping to develop as we go further.
yes, there are a number. You'll notice there are a number of women in the troop. And one of the challenging research things is the psychology of Meston, the psychology of Purcell, the psychology of the photographers, the psychology of the Aboriginal members of the troop, and exactly where their mind spaces were in this process. We have very little evidence about what was in the mind space of the Aboriginal people. Meston Butt was a prolific writer and was the alleged expert on Queensland Aborigines, and he became one of the architects of the Queensland Aboriginal Acts, the first act, and the first act came in 1898, and subsequent acts and Aboriginal protectors maintained those policies. Like there was Protector Bleakley in the 1920s and 30s who was still maintaining a lot of the ideas that Meston had projected into those acts. And in my view, it's arguable a lot of contemporary social problems have stemmed from a number of the things in those acts that occurred. So in a sense, the exhibition is a lens through Meston's head of his ideas on the Aboriginal race and what he was intending to do with them, which he did within 3 years of this exhibition. He wrote a report for the Queensland government on what they should do about the Queensland Aboriginal problem, and then went on to become the Southern Protector of Aborigines.
So you could say that, you know, this group are Meston's representation of the real Aborigines that won't be around for much longer. So that's why you need to come and pay your money to these performances and get to see them. And of course these people they're within a very racist framework. But somehow they agreed to go on this big venture. They apparently agreed to go on a world tour for 24 months, 24 moons, and they agreed. I think Bob, he got paid 3 pairs of trousers, 5 shirts, and lots of tobacco. And but he was the one complaining about not enough food down in Melbourne, and he was also complaining it was a bit cold as well. But so they were, you know, this was their job, so it's really difficult to sort of tell, you know, obviously they were complicit in this whole process. And they stayed together. The main group of 27 were all there. You know, I've seen the picture of them here on the Brisbane River at Chelmer, 12th of November 1892, and then they all are being photographed in February 1893 in Melbourne. That's the 27 that are on the photo here in Brisbane match up with every single one in the album in Melbourne. And again, I think all 27 of them got back to Sydney. And at least 25, I think, got back to Brisbane in July 1893. But the big issue was the fact that Meston left them after 4 days in Melbourne, would have been about the 1st of February. He left them because of the financial backers pulling out. And he came back to Brisbane and started lobbying the state government, and somehow successfully lobbied the state government into have the government believe that he was the expert on Aboriginal people, and he was the expert on how badly non-Aboriginal people were treating Aborigines all around Queensland. So not to mention the ones he'd left down in Melbourne, he got appointed. You know, how the Queensland government, well, that's I think the whole incredible part of the story, is that he was now in charge of developing Aboriginal policy. And as I say, and this is his view on Aboriginal people. They had to look like this to be real. And I guess everybody else didn't really count so much. Where everybody else was, as Paul just said, they were the Aboriginal problem.
Have we got any questions here?
Do you find any individuals in the photographs before the Welsh failure or after? Do we know?
That's the great mystery, because we're so fortunate to have this. It's only about a 9-month period where it's so incredibly well documented, but plus all the other, plus all the other written information about Purcell being up in the northwest looking for people. But, you know, this 9-month period from, well, essentially, you know, photographically from November to about June is so well documented, and all these press clippings. And I think Mandana can back me up. She really knows them all really well now after doing all the computer work, looking at their faces, their scars.
One thing.
Yeah.
We were just discussing something yesterday, that there were other troops in 1901. Meston did go on to have other troops, but I don't think any of these gentlemen appear in the next troop. So we would, except Yamura. The question would be, what was the lingering legacy that he left, and did these people ever see Meston again? His son was based up in Far North Queensland. He would have travelled to Ballindenker again. Some of these people may have been there, and, you know, what was their interaction? Did they have conversations? Did they really want to, you know, run the other way when they saw or heard about him coming to the area again? And those are the questions that I think we're definitely looking at answering.
Well, while doing the Wakai land claim, I had to do all the genealogies for all the Wakai people, and there was I was working with people who were alive, say they were adolescents in 1910, 1915. But and I had these photos of Gurujund, some of these photos, this bloke here, they couldn't recognise them. So I don't think that they got back to where they came from. And I also did genealogies for all of the people in Normanton in the 1990s. And they didn't there was no names in here that they threw up in those genealogies. So it's still a mystery whether they all got back, what happened to them. And one of our aims is to try to raise money for a travelling exhibition and to go to the communities where the descendants of these people are, and to do more research to see if we can make any links that I might have missed or not covered, and as much as possible to try and really repatriate them back to their communities of origin, even if it's only in an historical way.
Or a digital sense.
Digital repatriation.
There's a reference here in the exhibition to I think it was a Saturday in July 1893 when they hopped on a boat and all went north. And that really is, they just disappeared from the history books after that.
Yeah, the other boat trip, well, of course, was the paddle steamer that came up the Brisbane River for the Brisbane Press Club picnic, and so there's a photograph of this paddle steamer coming up, on which this woman is that Mandana's referred to, and it pulls in here and picks up the troop, and then they go to the Chelmer Reach for their performance and get out at the Chelmer Reach, which is where they're photographed, which is their first public outing and their first trial performance, which is quite important. I think you were going to ask a question.
Yes, a question about Meston, but first up, just a point about the Opera House.
Yeah.
That's was later Her Majesty's Theatre in Queen Street, so it's His Majesty's Opera House of the 1880s.
Yeah, I thought I'd hook you on that one, so I'll follow that up with you later.
On Meston, I'm perplexed how he was respectable after this debacle of abandoning the troop in Melbourne and just sort of splitting. Was there bad news about Meston as well?
There's a lot of controversy about it. There's lots of press clippings. There was an argument about who owned the artefacts. Meston sued Purcell, had him arrested in Sydney for selling the artefacts to try and get food for the Aboriginal people. That was very bitter, and there were letters going back to Tozer from both of them giving accounts of what had happened, which are in the archives, which I'd collected in the 1980s. So it's still difficult to make a judgment about exactly what happened, who was in the right and who was in the wrong. But it was a very vigorous, bad fallout.
He was a journalist and he was very good at what he did. So.
Yeah, and interestingly, we haven't been very successful in finding stuff out about Purcell, what happened to him in public life after that. So that's another research challenge.
There was a big economic depression in 1891-92. Would that be a reason that financial backers pulled out? And also, I also remember the sort of sign above the opera, saying Opera House above the Majesty's.
Yeah, well, we've got there's a lot to do about placing all this in a cultural, historical, economic, political context. One of the other, talking architecturally, one of the other places they performed was the Melbourne Exhibition Hall, which had been built on the money of the gold rushes in Victoria, and then Victoria was suffering then from the Depression when they got to Victoria. Another architectural one was that they were performing at the Bondi Pavilion in Bondi and also at the School of Arts when they arrived in Sydney. So we've got to track what that is. When they came back to Sydney, they were performing at Her Majesty's. So we're interested in developing a bigger book and a bigger exhibition that contextualises it all better in Boulia, Normanton, Thursday Island, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, architecturally, economically, historically, in all its dimensions, if we can find the right materials and visual, and particularly visual materials.
Yes, at the back.
Small question really. You made mention of Torres Strait before. Were there Torres Strait Islanders in the troop that you were aware of?
Yeah, well, these are the... over on this wall, the material culture of the Torres Strait Islands is very distinctively different, and you'll see the dress of these people over here. But in modern day anthropology, they're regarded as Cowreg people who actually identify today as Aboriginal people. So these were a group of Aboriginal people on the islands of the Torres Strait, off the tip of Cape York, which included Thursday Island and Horn Island and Hammond Island and Prince of Wales Island. But because of their position in the trade across the Straits to New Guinea and Cape York, they've got a mixture of cultural traits. Their material culture, they look more like Torres Strait Islanders than Aboriginal people. So one of the challenges for the anthropologist is understanding the cultural differences between the various groups in this troop. And by the time they get to Sydney and are being photographed in groups, they look like one group of one tribe, I think by that time they're probably teaching one another their corroborees, they're probably creatively ad-libbing with their paint up, pulling whatever artefacts they want to wear out of the 3,000 odd artefacts they've got with them.
And Meston claimed, he's proud of the fact that that's why he kept them at St Lucia for 3 months, so he could drill them and train them on how to be Aboriginal performers.
I wonder if you know much about the languages that they're using to speak to each other. You're sort of talking about a kind of cultural convergence, and I wonder whether there's much information about the kind of linguagram that people are using with each other, maybe the pidgin that was used sort of throughout the cattle stations and plantations at the time, or...
Yeah, we don't know anything about that, except they would have been talking a form of Aboriginal English. Purcell persuaded them to come, and he couldn't talk any Aboriginal languages. Meston claimed himself to be an expert on Aboriginal languages, but all he did was collect word lists mainly from other correspondence. So, again, a research challenge. We have to think what was frontier life like in Boulia, where these Wakai were brought in and where the police magistrate wrote to Tozer about them being taken away in chains. In Normanton, and this is where, we're on the frontier. The native police were still active in the very far northwest of Queensland, but most of the aggression and massacres of the native police had already occurred through most of Queensland. In northwest Queensland, it was in the Kalkadoons were wiped out in the 1880 to 1885. So we've got the one Kalkadoon guy who's being billed as one of the last Kalkadoon warriors in the show. And the native police had moved up to where Lawn Hill Gorge is today. In the early 1890s, they were massacring people up there, and then went up to Turnoff Lagoon by the mid 1890s. And there were people seeking refuge on friendly pastoral stations and coming in. There were town camps starting, fringe camps in these towns. The press in the early 1890s was about getting these disgusting Aboriginal people out of the towns who were in the fringe camps. Something has to be done in Parliament. There was a lot of agitation going on. So it's a time when Aboriginal people are having to deal with white people to get labour, to get food, to get protection from aggressive people. And I'm quite confident they're all talking some form of Aboriginal English. But there's only one interview in this whole thing that we found with one of the Aboriginal troop who quotes about 4 lines, No.
So you can, going on information, you can try and ask why did Kerry write down one name and why did Lint write down another name, and you don't really know. Was it Meston or was it Purcell who gave Kerry that information? Was it the Aboriginal person themselves? And the same with Lint. You just don't. We're just left with these tiny scraps of information.
Yeah, there's a lot of miscommunication going on, that's for sure.
You were going to ask a question? Wendy?
Yes, you talked about the story of some people being taken away in chains. But in a sense, once they were induced to join this troop, they were all captains. I'm just trying to imagine people getting on a boat to go from Brisbane to Sydney, who came from the interior of Queensland. And what it would be like to make that sea journey and to be totally reliant the whole time on somebody else just to eat.
Yeah, well, I've just written a chapter for a book about my instructions to get Aluwara people from the Sandover River to go to an initiation ceremony on Mornington Island, and their fear of this strange thing called salt water that goes up and down and has these savage beasts in it that can eat you alive, something called chuck. And the reluctance to go and all the problems that we had. There is one quote, there's one little mention in one of Purcell's articles about the Wakai tasting salt water at Townsville and using this word which means devil in their speech and saying that it must be something to do with the devil. So there is obviously a lot of fear, but the issue about the chains is again an ongoing research problem, because Purcell defended himself and said that he went to Glen Ormiston Station and he collected some Aboriginal people who wanted to come on the troop, namely the ones who did come, and the pastoralist encouraged him to take these other two that were scoundrels who he wanted to get rid of, and encouraged him to chain them up, which he did. And then that they escaped a couple of nights later. That was in his correspondence to the Colonial Under-Secretary. The police magistrate and the manager of Tobermory and Glen Ormiston are providing another account saying that he forcefully took them in chains. So we don't know the facts of that, and we don't have any evidence that anyone else was taken in chains. So as Michael says, he thinks they were born to have adventure.
I mean, it's up to the viewer to have a look at these photos, and personally, I don't see victims. As Paul says, we're talking about people who were really facing frontier violence. They potentially could have been shot at any time back in their home country, and here they are. There's two of these guys from the desert at Luna Park, looking very happy. So it all depends how you interpret it. To me, I'll give them credit that they were performers, that they were on a world venture. They agreed to go to Chicago. The plan was Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, New Zealand, Europe, and Chicago, and they were supposed to be in Chicago by about June 1893, I think. They didn't make it, but coincidentally, some of Henry King's photos of them did make it to the World Fair in Chicago in 1893.
So that's what I mean about the gaze and what's in their minds. Are they looking out saying, we're really digging these cameras and things and working and seeing these things called photographs? They're walking out into George Street, Sydney, and seeing all of this material culture, trying all of these foods, new drugs and things. They might have been getting homesick and wanting to go home. So exactly what is going on in their minds? This is the challenge. This is like the capturing of these faces, and now we've got 120 or 30 years mediating between us and them. So it's a challenge for all of you to think about what's in their minds.
In trying to understand their story, perhaps. Looking at the different images and seeing the different expressions, I think something that's struck at me from having to study them up close, very personally and up close, is that there are a couple of reoccurring smiles and smirking smiles. There are a couple of reoccurring stern, strong faces. The photographers at the time would have been asking these guys to pose. I said it flippantly, and it does make me feel awkward saying it, but their best noble savage pose. And that these photographers would have had examples of the photographs that they were selling at the time. The Aboriginal performers would have seen these examples and would have had a realisation that they were being commodified, that their image was going to be reprinted and re-represented and possibly used for something that they had no control over. But I think I'd like to give them a bit more credit to know that they were actually understanding that process and they were seeing that visually in front of them. Each time they were in the studio, each time the photographer was taking his time to set up in the landscape, they kind of would see the process and we'd love to know what was actually going on in their heads, but I think that's something we're hoping that people like Stephen and contemporary artists of today will actually respond to these images and start maybe reclaiming the voices and speaking about these individuals as human beings and not as one of the 27 or 32.
One of the things you can't gauge from this exhibition is the fact that some of them were photographed more than others. So some of them we only have like one or two photos that were taken. It was Lint in Melbourne who went through and photographed every member. But when they arrived in Sydney, for some reason, certain people were promoted as the most photogenic. Whether it was Purcell and Meston promoting them, or the photographers picking them out, or whether it was a matter of their personalities promoting them. But we find that the Wakaya were the most, generally the most photographed, particularly the males. Would that be right, Mike?
But I think that they were the stars. They were the most marketable. In one sense, these were all the real Aborigines, but they were the really real ones. They were the ones from the desert, so I think they were marketed as such. Oh, well, I guess, I guess the basic, the exhibition is in chronological order, and Mandana and I sort of worked on trying to work on, how best to portray it. But I guess you could say in some ways we've treated the photos in a contemporary sort of art gallery type format. Nothing real fancy, but we have, they're cropped nice and neat. They're hung in a fairly modern style, and we've grouped them in chronological order. We only have 5 photos of them in Brisbane. At least we've managed to name confirm the photographer of 2 of those photos, Will Stark, a local photographer that I'm sort of familiar with a lot of his work. That's these 2 here. The other 3 photos, we're not quite sure who took them, quite possibly Stark. And then I guess we had to mix, there was different numbers of photos of each photographer, but we really tried to space it out so that each of the 3 main photographers got sort of equal billing. And it's in order from the outside walls. We're starting with Brisbane on the opposite side of that, where that cabinet is. Got these walls for when they first arrived in Sydney, late 1892, then Melbourne, and then the far walls are when they were returned back to Sydney in June. And we don't have any photos of them when they came back to Brisbane on the return. So, and then the middle area we've got, well, as you can see, we thought we're very proud of the fact that we've got Meston locked up in a glass cabinet. Sort of, I think, playing on the fact that so many white researchers and have locked Aboriginal culture up in cabinets, so now we've got him in one.
So there are a couple of interesting analyses that have been published by scholars of Meston. One, an honours thesis by Bill Thorpe. I think he was one of Ray Evans' students, and Cheryl is I've just forgotten her name, but in the back of the catalogue there's another person who's written about analysed his journalism, and he's been accused of like homoerotica, gymnophobia, his fascination about, he was said to be the strongest man in Queensland in one report. He was a boxer, a weightlifter, an athlete. He took great pride in his physical prowess of stripping down and showing his body off. He claimed to be equal to Aboriginal people at throwing boomerangs and spears. He quite frequently combated with them. in these demonstrations, and there's a lot made out about what was... He had this thing that wild Aboriginal people were great athletes, and that was part of their quality, their sort of physique and physical capacities, and that's what he wanted to portray in the show.
But lacking in intelligence.
Yes, he said, at one point he wrote that it would take 200 years on reserves to get them to a point of taking up agriculture. So there's a lot of speculation about what turned him on and on his the psychology of what he was doing in these things.
So any more questions? Yes, Catherine?
Good question, because they had to perform outdoors and indoors. So if you look at the two advertisements on the front wall when you walk in the museum, you'll see some of the things listed that what they were doing. At the Brisbane Exhibition Grounds, you could get a free tram or a discount tram to throwing flaming spears and flaming boomerangs at night. And then the stage sets were for indoor performances. And you'll see outdoor photos where they're doing things like tracking, showing tracking skills. They were doing fire making, demonstrating fire making. There was a lot of weaponry demonstration. Meston was fascinated with weaponry. He was right into collecting weapons. And then we've got the various narratives that they developed in their performances. And we've got the photos of the native police. So there's a simulated attack of the Aboriginal people on there's one case where they attack a white shepherd, another case where they attack a white stockman and a white pastoralist, and then the native police, some of them dress up as native police and take retribution and shoot them. And these are the stories, these were things that were going on the frontier at the time and not long before. So they were in everybody's memory. The Aboriginal people themselves would have experienced the native police, and some of their relatives would have been killed by native police. So there's quite a diversity of performances. There's just looking at the scars and the scarifications, and then there's lectures being given by both Meston and Purcell about, as I said earlier, sensationalising certain cultural traits. Meston and Purcell were both fascinated about body mutilation, body surgery, initiation surgeries on both men and women, and this was very much written about and popularised in the international ethnographic journals of the time about these Aboriginal surgical operations and trying to contextualise that in all of the theories about race and evolution that were being projected out there at the time.
And of course Meston had to mention cannibalism. He says that this man here, Gita, he said that he, previous years, had feasted on roast Dutchmen.
One of the questions that jumped out at me when I was studying the photographs is, especially for this Will Stark photograph, was it Meston setting up the scene and choreographing and asking the photographer to make sure that everyone was in the frame, or was it the Aboriginals acting out a skirmish and this particular one, there's two gentlemen seated underneath the tent and they look like they're going about their business, but then the Aboriginals are actually creeping up. If you study it really closely, you'll see at least about 17 figures in the background. So it would have taken someone producing, choreographing, staging the scene. Was it Meston? Was it the photographer? Or was it the Aboriginal performers sort of setting it up?
Another thing we should reflect on is am I Meston? There's some anthropologists here tonight. Are you Meston? We are in a situation today where we're being asked to give policy advice on different things. Policy advice on Aboriginal crowding, policy advice on family violence, policy advice on Aboriginal housing, this and that. What makes us different to Meston? So it's a lens to look at ourselves as well in the contemporary situation.
please join me in thanking them, and I'm sure that there's more questions